Hello ladies and gents, in this video we will talk about validation of UI5 controls. What I want to do here is when we are creating a new product, I want to set some of our input fields here as required, and I don't want to allow the user to create it if they are empty, and also somehow show the user which fields are missing. Now to implement this, let's go to our app and in models.js file here, let's create a new JSON model to keep track of the validation status of our inputs. So I will copy this method here and name this create validation model. And I will set the validation status as true by default for all our inputs. And binding mode again two-way. We save and we go to our component.js and also create and set it on our component. So set the validation model, models.create validation model. We save and remember we were resetting our input model when our dialog is closed. So let's go to app controller, and here we are resetting our input model, and we also need to reset our new validation model. So let's also do that and set it as validation. And I think I forgot to rename this one. Name it validation and save. Now let's go to our input fragment here, create product fragment, and let's set some of the fields as required. We will begin with the product name, and the label control has an attribute named required, and we set it to true. And next category also want it to be required, so let's copy this. Next price, a product has to have a price, and release date also should be required, and that should be enough. Now let's check our app and how it looks. Now as you can see, by setting the required to true for a label, it adds this asterisk here to let the user know that this field is required, but that's all it does, so it's just cosmetic. Now let's go back, and for the actual inputs themselves, we have an attribute named value state for some of our input controls. For example, for product name, let's try to set it value state equals, and by default it's none, so we don't see any styling. Let's try the error one, for example, which is we are going to use. If the value state is error, we see it like this. Let's try another one, warning, for example. And warning looks something like this, and we can also customize these messages, but we won't do this for now. And we want this to be set dynamically according to our validation status here. So let's bind these values using expression binding again. So we use curly braces equals, and then we say dollar curly braces and the name of the model validation, and this is the one for the product name, so it's called just name. If this is true, we don't want any styling, so we set it to none. If it's false, we set it to error. And let me copy this one. And next one is category. Let's paste it here. And this time it's not name, but category. Let's also break this into multiple lines. Okay, next required one is the price input. So we do the same. Need to copy it again. And the field name this time is price. And lastly, the release date. So this date picker here. And the name is release date. And if we check now, since all of them are true, so valid by default, we won't see anything different, but I see an error. Let's see. Expression binding, okay, looks like a typo. Okay, this looks good, this looks good. Oh, okay, I didn't actually complete the Turner expression, so we need a question mark here, not a column. And also here, here should be one more, yes, the price. And now if we check, everything will look just the same, since all our controls are valid by default. Now to do the actual validation, let's go to our app controller and create a new private method here named validate. Need a comma here after this one. And here let's get all the input values first. So we say const o input equals this dot get view. First we get the input model, so get model input. And then we say get data to get the data object from our model. Let's also get our validation model, so const o validation model equals, let me copy it from here. I will just get the model this time, not the data object. And here we can check mandatory input or inputs. And we want to set these properties on our validation model accordingly. So I say validation model.set property. And the property is /name for the first one, for the product name. And I want to check if all input dot name is truthy. It's a string, so let's if we add one exclamation mark, it will be true if it's empty, and we want the opposite, so we add 2. And let me duplicate this for the other fields. Next one was category. Next we had the price. And lastly we had the release date. So when any of these are false, with our expression binding here, it will add the value state error. And lastly we need to return the validation status, and let's add a command here. And what we will do is we will return false if any of these are false, and otherwise we will return true. So we say return, we need the values of our validation model. So let's say our validation model dot get data, which will return us the data object. And since we want to get the values, we say object.values, which will give us an array of all our values in our object. So it will be something like true, 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 false, etc. And we want to see if it includes false, so if any of them are false. And this means it's invalid, and we want to return the opposite of this. So if it's invalid, we want to return false, otherwise we want to return true. Let's save and use this method when we want to create a new product. Okay, here on press create new product, we get the data from our input, and first thing we should do is to check if all our fields are valid. So let's say validate input, and we say if this dot validate returns false, we add an exclamation mark, we simply return and do not save the new product. We save, go back and check our app. If I don't enter any data and click on create, I get this error styling for all the missing input. And if we fill some of them and release date, now the only one missing is the product name. Let's edit dummy product. And now if I click on create, I can see my new product here. Now with this validation, of course, you can go crazy with much more complex logic here, but for the sake of simplicity, I will leave it here. And that ends this video, and hope to see you in the next one.